Well, I'd like you to picture with me a piano student. Let's call her Esperanza. And she's, let's say, 10 years old and has had piano lessons for 3 years. And she's excited about a recital, and she invites her very favorite uncle, Uncle Luis. And he comes. Now, he arrives just as the piano teacher is welcoming the audience, and he finds a seat with Esperanza's parents and siblings, and he's picked up a program on his way in, and he sees that Esperanza is number 17 of 29 students. So he settles back to listen to the recital. But a couple of students in, he takes out his cell phone and he checks the score of the soccer game that he's missing. And then he sees he has a couple text messages, so he reads those and he answers a couple. Oh, he checks the weather, scans the news headlines until it's Esperanza's turn to play. And then he puts his phone down. He listens with enthusiasm while his favorite niece plays the piano. He claps appreciatively when she's done. After she takes a seat, he takes his cell phone back out and proceeds to engage himself with his phone for the rest of the recital. Now, you might be thinking, how rude. But instead of focusing on his audience manners, I want to focus on the missed opportunity of that teacher to create a recital experience designed to engage all of the audience, including Uncle Luis, from start to finish. So no one's afraid, no one's tempted by their cell phone. Now, a confession, I used to be a teacher like that, and I used to have recitals like that. So I'm here today to share with you my experience of how I grew from having ho-hum recitals to striving to design recitals that engage my audience, really captivate them from start to finish. The year was 2012, and I was a brand new MTNA member. I had been teaching piano lessons in Reno, Nevada for 18 years in complete isolation. I didn't know any other piano teachers. I had no idea there was a national association, a professional organization for independent music teachers. It was just news to me. I didn't even know about the Northern Nevada Music Teachers Association, my very active local affiliate. But once I joined, my eyes were open to the world of all the support that's available for piano teachers. And I was excited to start to receive the American Music Teacher magazine. And one of the very first issues I received had an article about student attrition and the problem of junior high students dropping out of music lessons because social interaction becomes so much more important. And they get into sports or band or orchestra, and those things tend to trump a solitary activity like playing the piano. So to put this in context, I was a new empty nester. My children had gone away for college, and I decided that in my empty nest years, I wanted to focus on becoming a better piano teacher and growing my studio. So of course I was interested in this concept of student attrition due to a lack of students feeling like they were part of something bigger than just themselves. Believe it or not, that decision right there is what set me down a path that led me to where I am today and the kind of recitals I have. And I know that might seem unlikely, but I'm going to tell you that story, and I think by the end of the webinar, you'll understand how I got from there to where I am now. So you might be wondering, how do I know my recitals are so special, right? I know I'm kind of tooting my own horn here, but the short answer to that is the feedback I get from audience members. And maybe a secondary answer is just the size of the audience that my recitals attract. So that's how I can come to you kind of confidently saying, I have pretty good recitals and I'd like to share with you why. So I'm going to switch to PowerPoint now, and I'm told it'll take a few seconds for you to actually see my slides. So while you're waiting for that to happen, I did just want to say, you know that there's a chat window, and you are welcome, of course, to type comments or questions along the way, but I am not watching that chat window because I am way too easily distracted. So please type your comments, ask any questions you have along the way, and in about 45 minutes, when I'm finished with my presentation, then I will open that window, I'll look at your questions and answer them if I can. So please take advantage of that, but just know it's not like a Facebook Live event where I am watching those at the moment, all right? And then the other thing is, of course, this webinar will be archived on mtna.org. So if you have to leave early or if you just want to go back and revisit something, it'll be there available for you. I will also post a resource list of the resources I mentioned during the webinar, so you can also find that on mtna.org. All right, so the subject of creating audience engaging recitals and why I think my recitals are something special. So receive a lot of audience feedback, and my slides are not, oh, there we go. All right. I receive a lot of audience feedback, and I just want to share with you some of the specific comments that I receive repeatedly about my recitals. So this one, I never knew a recital could be so interesting. Now, what I love about this comment is the implication behind it. Do you see the implication, which is piano recitals are not very interesting. So when somebody comes to one that is, this is their primary reaction. I never knew a recital could be so interesting. And how about this one? Please don't ever have a recital again without inviting me. Now, I've heard this several times, but I want to tell you about the last 2 times I heard this. So last spring, I had a recital, and there's a mom of one of my students who invites a friend of hers to all my recitals, and the friend usually attends. In this particular recital, the friend invited a friend. Well, that friend's mother had recently moved into the area, so she was wanting to give her mother some social interaction and meet some people and do some things. So she brought her mother to my recital. And it was the mother who said this to me: please don't ever have a recital again without inviting me. So I want you to appreciate the degrees of separation between the student who was playing in the recital and the woman who said this, right? She's the mother of a friend of the mom of the student. The other time I heard this last year was just in November after my fall recital. And the day before my recital, I had joined my husband and a colleague of his for lunch. I don't normally do this. It was an unusual situation. And during lunch, I mentioned that the next day my students were having a recital, and my husband's colleague was interested. And so I invited him, and he came, and he said this to me at the end of the recital: please don't ever have a recital again without inviting me. So this is someone with no connection to any of my students, just a connection with me through my husband. All right, another comment I've heard: your recitals are the highlight of my year. In fact, in the fall, I had the aunt of one of my students come up to me and say, we live in California, but every year we put on our calendar to make a trip to Reno the weekend before Thanksgiving so that we can come to your recital. So that's pretty high praise. I appreciated that. More than anything, I hear this: every time I come to one of your recitals, I leave knowing so much more than when I came. And then this comment: your recitals never disappoint. And I appreciate this because there's also an implication behind that, right? What is that implication? Well, it's someone coming to my recital expecting something out of it, right? Unlike the first comment where the expectation is for it not to be interesting, this person is coming expecting something and then not being disappointed. All right, and then I have one more comment to share with you. And truthfully, I added this comment just this morning because a student yesterday said it to me. So in the interest of full disclosure, I do think I need to share this comment with you. My grandma says, "Why do your recitals have to be so long and have so much history in them?" So I can appreciate that not everyone loves my recitals, and they do tend to be long, and I work on that constantly. But I think the balance of feedback I get indicates that I hope this is a minority opinion. And interestingly, just so you know, the student who told me this was Esperanza, whose name I stole for my opening hypothetical situation. All right, so now back to the question. How did I get from this decision to find some way to help my students feel part of a group and a team so that piano is not so solitary? How did I get from that decision to having recitals that garnered this kind of feedback? So here's what you need to know about me. I love history. I love to read. I love biographies. And of course, I'm passionate about music. So I am passionate about music history. So I decided the thing I want to do is have what I called a music history party. Have all of my students together at the same time. Now, my studio was small. I only had 7 students at this point, but have them all in my home, eat a meal together, and teach them some music history, and do that in a fun way and in a way that would help them bond together, get to know each other. That happened. My first music history party was February 1st, 2013. So that is exactly 7 years ago tomorrow. This is a super fun way to celebrate that anniversary of my first music history party. Had my students over to my house. I taught them about Johann Sebastian Bach. We had a great time. And then a month later, I just did it again. And I taught them about Beethoven. And after, well, first, how did I do that? And I want to share this with you because I owe a lot to Joy Morin. The thing that I used to teach my students about Bach and Beethoven were Joy Morin's lap books. Now, if you're not familiar with them, you can buy them on colorinmypiano.com. And these are some images that I pulled from Joy's website. This is the lap book for Beethoven. So a lap book is a PDF that you pay a little bit of money for. And when you print it off, it contains everything you see in these pictures to take a file folder and turn it into a booklet just packed full of information about the composer. And you see there's a booklet with a story of Beethoven's life. She gives you a YouTube playlist, suggested music to play. There are always pictures and a map and lots of information. They're just great. So I used the one for Johann Sebastian Bach and the one for Beethoven for those first 2 music history parties. And I have used a number of them since, although the point came when she didn't have a lap book for the composer I needed, and I had to create my own music history party. And actually, since that time, I haven't used her lap books very much, but super grateful to her for getting me started and giving me a resource to use. So if you're not familiar with Joy Morin's lap books, go check them out at colorinmypiano.com. This was the recital program, the cover of it. So after those music history parties, I gave each of my students a piece of music by Bach and a piece of music by Beethoven. And then we had a recital with those pieces. It was all Bach and all Beethoven. And before each student played their Bach piece, they had been given some information to read about Bach's life. So they shared some fun facts about Bach, played their piece, played their Beethoven piece. The audience left knowing a little bit more about Bach than when they came. It was hardly the most exciting recital ever, but it was a big step beyond what I'd been doing. And I got a lot of great feedback from parents. So that was the first recital that really set me on this trajectory toward creating recitals that would be wrapped together with music history, teaching my students first, and then teaching the audience second. So I have a disclaimer to make. What I want to do next is talk you through the process that I go through to get from an idea to a recital. But here's my disclaimer. I have a small studio. I have 16 students and a waiting list. All of my lessons are either 60 minutes or 90 minutes. And I know my limitations. I'm not particularly good at teaching very young children. So just about 3 years ago, I instituted a policy of not accepting students younger than about 9 years old. That means my studio is a little on the older side. And then I know my limitations as a teacher. So when I get a student who gets beyond late intermediate and into early advanced music, I begin to encourage them to find a more advanced teacher, and I help them in that process. So I'm just telling you that because I feel like my studio situation is unique, right? It's small size, it's older student population, while at the same time, lower levels of students. And I know, I can't imagine that there's someone listening to this whose situation is just like mine, right? We're all different. Our studios are as different as we are. So I know that what I'm about to share with you will not directly transfer to your studio situation. And I just want to acknowledge that up front. But I'm hopeful that something I say, some idea might trigger something in you, and you'll find some way to adapt maybe a little bit of what I do into your teaching situation to make your recitals even better than they are. So there's my disclaimer, all right? I know my situation is not the same as yours, but I still think we have a lot to learn from each other. All right, so here we go. What's the process I go through to create a really audience-engaging recital? So the first step is the idea. And most often, this is a composer I want to teach my students about, or more than one composer. Sometimes it's a bigger idea that I then have composers that fit the theme, but always it's linked to particular composers I want to teach my students about. And then after the idea, the next step is I choose the music. And this is probably the first place that I began to significantly diverge in my recital planning. Because until this time, what I would do was, it's the end of the year is coming and we need to have a recital, and just look at what my students were playing and pick and choose maybe some combination of the things they played best and the things they enjoyed the most, and put them together in a recital program. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's sort of a musical potluck. There's really nothing in all of that to pull it together into one cohesive unit. So I choose the recital music right after I get the idea. So I have an idea, I have one or more composers I want to teach my students about, and then I go and I find music for all my students. And that means beginner level and late beginner, early intermediate, intermediate, maybe late intermediate, maybe I have a couple students who can handle early advanced, but choosing music for all of them first. And sometimes for one student, I might have 2 or 3 options, but a lot of times I just hand a piece of music to a student and say, here's your recital piece. So that's step 2, I choose all the music for the recital. And then step 3 is I plan 1 or more music history parties to teach my students about those composers. And I found that when you get a student engaged in understanding the life and times of a composer, then they're really excited to get music by that composer and play it. So I love music history party for engaging my students with the music they're going to play. That's partly how I can get away with just handing them a piece of music. We'll do a music party on, let's say, Scarlatti, and students will come to their next lesson all excited. What's my Scarlatti piece? Or, what am I going to play? I just love that element of this. mean, the truth is, as humans, we just love a good story. So if you can pull your students into the story of composers' lives, then they really are engaged and eager to play their music. And then with that foundation, then the last step is plan the recital with the intention of teaching my audience what I've already taught the students. And I intersperse the music throughout the recital. So what that looks like for me is I literally have a script I read from. I narrate the recital. I usually have a PowerPoint presentation with images, because in our very image-driven culture, a picture really is worth thousands of words. So the combination of my script, storytelling, and images for the audience, and then interspersed with fabulous music by my students. That, in a nutshell, is the recipe for, I believe, a recital that can really engage and entertain and excite an audience and make them eager for the next one. So that's the process. And what I'm going to do for the remainder of our time together is I'm just going to walk you through some of my favorite recitals through these 4 steps, from idea to musical choice to music history party, and then what the recital actually looked like. So here we go. I think it was fall of 2015. My big idea was painting pictures with music. I wanted to teach my students about Impressionism, both in art and in music, and of course, means I wanted to teach them about Debussy and Ravel. But then I also love pictures in an exhibition. So even though that's orchestral and I'm a piano teacher, I wanted to expose my students to that music and to Modest Mussorgsky. So this was my big idea. Now, this idea is a little problematic when you have a lot of beginner and early intermediate students. I think you can appreciate that, right? Mussorgsky did write piano transcriptions for pictures at an exhibition, but it's on the advanced side. So what is one to do? So when it came to choosing the music, I loved finding this resource. So I don't know if you're familiar with Schott and the series Get to Know Classical Masterpieces. But these are piano transcriptions at a fairly easy intermediate level of famous orchestral works. This one, of course, being pictures in an exhibition. So I had several of my students play out of this. But then the beginner students were still a problem. And I decided I wanted to use Catherine Rollin's museum masterpieces. Now, actually, at the time, there were 4 books, and they were intermediate level, but she just published 2 new volumes, Book A and Book B. I just got them yesterday in the mail and had fun sitting down to play them. Book A is beginner level with duet accompaniments. Book B is more late beginner, and they're just fabulous. If you're not familiar with museum masterpieces, these books have in the center heavy glossy paper and reproductions of famous works of art. And then Catherine Rollin has written music to go along with them. So that was some of the music I used for my more beginner, early intermediate students. Some of my later students were able to play some of the easier Debussy or the Mussorgsky piano transcription. So I did use a little bit of that. Okay, there's my idea. I've chosen a piece of music for each of my students to go with that idea. So then step 3 is plan a music history party. And I actually had 2 of them. The first party, I wanted to introduce them to the museum masterpieces, Mussorgsky and Pictures in an Exhibition. So here's how I did that. For the museum masterpieces, I created PowerPoint slides with 4 different images. I had several slides, several sets of images. And then I was in my piano studio. So I actually played, one of those 4 pieces, and then the students had to guess which one I was playing. So we did several pieces like that to introduce them to the idea of having a work of art and then a piece of music written to go with that. Then I wanted to teach them about the life of Modest Mussorgsky and the story behind the writing of pictures in an exhibition. So to do that, I used Classics for Kids radio programs. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this website, but I love it, classicsforkids.com. Classics for Kids are 6-minute radio programs. This is, I think, Cincinnati Public Radio who does this. And I took this image, this was just their homepage a couple weeks ago, where their episode of the week was about Prokofiev and musical sleigh rides. These are just great radio programs aimed at introducing kids to famous classical music, composers, other musical ideas. Can't recommend it highly enough. So Classics for Kids has a Modest Mussorgsky episode that just tells about the life of Modest Mussorgsky. So I played that for my students. I had made a PowerPoint presentation with images. So as they're listening to the radio program, they're looking at images of Mussorgsky and other things. But then Classics for Kids also has an episode just about pictures at an exhibition. So I also played that episode and put together a PowerPoint of the pictures that were the inspiration for pictures in an exhibition. And that was very fun. That's how I introduced Mussorgsky and pictures in an exhibition. I had another music history party to teach them about Impressionism and Debussy and Ravel. I did actually use the Debussy lap book from Joy Morin. And I had a PowerPoint presentation about Impressionism in art and in music, so I also used that. But then to teach them about Ravel, I showed them this film. So don't know if you're familiar with Whole Notes. This was a TV series by John Kimura Parker. Some of the episodes are available on Amazon for streaming, or you can purchase them. I use the episode called The Color of Music, which is about Maurice Ravel. And it focuses on bolero. That's most of the music you hear through the film. Now, granted, these films are aimed at older students. So I engaged some of my younger students by having fill-in-the-blank handouts that they needed to fill in. And I had those at several different levels for students at different levels. This is how I taught them about Ravel. So those two music history parties, and then the fourth step, of course, is plan the recital to teach my audience what I taught my students through those music history parties. So here you see on the right side of the screen, the invitation to the recital, Painting Pictures with Music, November 21st, it was 2015. I want to mention that because this is one thing I do to promote my recitals. I make invitations, and my students go home with several invitations, and with my telling them, go invite your friends, invite people you know at your church, invite your family and your extended family. I give the parents invitations to pass on to their friends. So I am sort of a shameless promoter of my own recitals, but this is one way I do that. And then you see my students. At this point, my studio had grown. I think there are 11 students there. And that recital, I taught the audience about Impressionism and Impressionistic music. And I did have a couple students play a Debussy. Someone played the Satie Gymnopédie No. 1. And then several students played music from the Pictures at an Exhibition simplified version. And I taught the audience about Mussorgsky and that composition. And then everyone played a piece from Museum Masterpieces while I projected the art on the screen. So that was how that recital went. It was a lovely evening, beautiful recital. Of course, this is the teacher talking on prejudice. All right, let's move on to another one. Here was my big idea. I wanted to have a recital themed on music for stage and screen. And I wanted to teach my students about Edvard Grieg, and in particular, the music for Peer Gynt, which of course is a play, and then the amazing John Williams, who just won his 25th Grammy Award for the Star Wars music. So there was my big idea. And of course, the next step is choose the music. And when it came to Grieg and Peer Gynt, Grieg also wrote piano transcriptions for some of the music from Peer Gynt. There are two suites of music, but that is orchestral music. So what did I do? Well, shot to the rescue again and get to know classical masterpieces. They have a Peer Gynt volume. So all the pieces from Peer Gynt simplified for intermediate, early intermediate level piano. I appreciated this just as much for the artwork because I ended up scanning the artwork and using it in my recital PowerPoint, maybe also my music history PowerPoint. So it was useful for that. So that was one of the resources I used. And then, of course, it's easy to find John Williams music. This book, produced by Hal Leonard, John Williams for Beginning Piano Solo. Sometimes the book will say it's easy piano, and it's really intermediate level, but this is truly beginner, 14 beginner pieces. And then this Dan Coates book, which is more intermediate. What I wanted to tell you about these is I bought 2 copies of each of these. I am a stickler for keeping copyright law and not making copies of music. So I bought 2 copies of each of these, and I had the spine removed, and I mounted each individual piece on cardstock so that I could have many, many pieces for my students to choose from while only buying 4 books. So just a suggestion that might come in handy for you sometime. All right, the idea, the music chosen, now music history parties to teach my students about Edvard Grieg and the life of John Williams and how he ended up where he ended up as a screenwriter. So I had 2 parties. The first one was to teach my students about Grieg and Peer Gynt, and I actually used 3 Classics for Kids programs with a PowerPoint presentation. They have one on the life of Grieg, they have one on the story of Peer Gynt, and then they have one just on incidental music. And I wanted to introduce my students to that concept of music not written for the concert hall, but for something else like a play or a film. So that was our Grieg music history party. And we always eat together, and I often have games, but the point of the evening is always to teach them and to be educational and for them to learn. But it's not dry, right? My students love these parties. They're a lot of fun. And then to teach my students about John Williams, I did research his life. I had a PowerPoint presentation about his life and his growing up years and his background. But then I just went to YouTube and searched for John Williams interviews. And of course, there are dozens of them. And I listened to a whole bunch and chose the very best ones that I thought would be suited for my students. So a lot of that music history party was listening to John Williams talk about himself and his life and his work. And so that was just great. So all my students, of course, then were working on Grieg music or John Williams music. And then for the recital, I plan to teach my audience about those composers. So I called the recital the soundtrack of our lives. And this is an excerpt from the program. So I divided it into scenes, 3 scenes. So scene 1 was Edvard Grieg, and I told the story of Grieg's life. And you see 4 students there played Grieg pieces interspersed throughout the story of his life. And then scene 2 was the story of Peer Gynt. So I used those drawings, paintings from the Schott book, and I literally told the story of Peer Gynt. It's a little quirky, and I maybe edited it just a little bit for child appropriateness. And then throughout, when it was appropriate, then students played pieces from the Peer Gynt music. So that was the first half of the recital. And then the second half was the John Williams music. And I thought it would be kind of fun in the program to list the students in the order they played, and then list the pieces that they played in the order they were written. And then the audience, it was a matching activity for the audience. So a student played, and the audience had to try to figure out what piece that was. And then at the end, we gave them the answers. So this was what the recital looked like. And I got lots of positive feedback. Interestingly, I expected people to love the John Williams stuff, and they did. But just as much, the audience loved the Grieg and Peer Gynt part of the recital. And I think Part of that is especially the Peer Gynt music in the Hall of the Mountain King and Morning. I think those are pretty well known, even for people who aren't classical music buffs. So I think people in the audience who had heard in the Hall of the Mountain King or Morning really enjoyed hearing about who wrote that, but then what it was written for, and this interesting play in that story. People love story. I know I've already told you that, but it's true. So this is a great fun recital, the soundtrack of our lives. All right, moving on. Next idea. I wanted to have a recital celebrating pedagogical composers because of the fact that I teach beginner and intermediate students primarily. So I chose Muzio Clementi and William Gillock and decided I would teach my students and my recital audience about those two composers. So I don't need to tell you, the Clementi Opus 36 sonatinas are a beautiful source of music for intermediate students, but then there's so much Gillock music at all levels. So this was super easy to choose music for all my students for this recital. For the music history parties, I had a Clementi party. I'm not going to talk much about that. It was more interesting than it sounds like. But then this was 2017, and it was the 100th anniversary of William Gillock's birth. So we had a birthday party for Mr. Gillock. And you see my students there in birthday hats and eating birthday cupcakes. And my studio has continued to grow at this point. I have more students. And then I made this big pencil sketch of a picture of William Gillock. And we played Pin the Birthday Hat on Mr. Gillock. But remember, I'm about teaching history. So while we have fun at the parties, they're really about teaching my students about the composers. So just loved telling my students the story of William Gillock's life. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he entered college wanting to be a music major and compose. And he could play quite advanced literature, but he could not read it, because he was one of those students, and we all have them, who could play by ear well. And, you know, once he heard something, he didn't need the music any longer. And so he had a professor in college who I think spoke to him quite firmly about, if you want to be a composer, you must learn to read and write music. And so he just did that. And I loved the opportunity to reinforce in my students the idea that there is such a thing as inborn talent, but it doesn't get you very far without discipline. And playing by ear is great, but it can be a handicap. And it's never too late to learn something new. It was just a wonderful teaching opportunity for all those life lessons. All right, for the recital then, remember my goal is teach the audience about Muzio Clementi, teach the audience about William Gillock, and intersperse music by those composers throughout it. So I called the recital Mrs. Harris and Her BFFs. Of course, that's best friends forever, celebrating two composers who make the life of a piano teacher delightful. I just love these guys. You know, I love the composers who write for teachers. And here's the first couple pages of the program. We started with Muzio Clementi. And you know, he wrote a method book, Introduction to the Art of Playing on the Piano Forte. And you can actually find a PDF of his method book online. It's pretty easy to find. And I showed it to my students. Super fun for them to look at, this very old piano method book. But as I began to talk about Clementi and talk about his method book, then I had students actually play 4 pieces from that. His lesson number 1 is this little Mozart tune, Away with Melancholy, that of course he simplified for beginners. So that was kind of fun. And then we had a number of the movements from the Opus 36 sonatinas. But remember, the students didn't just play those all in a row. That music was interspersed in between my narrating about the life of Muzio Clementi. And of course, it's interesting because he made money with music in many different ways, from his method book to his own performance career and his piano production company and his music publishing company. Lots of interesting things to talk about. And he had a lot of setbacks in his life too, so I focused on those. I also want you to see in this program the glossary of terms. You know, we're just so used to classical music in this world we inhabit, but our recital audiences aren't necessarily. So I feel like it does our audience a great favor when we define terms for them. So I put that in the program. And then the second half of the recital was just, I told some about William Gillock's life, but then just all my students played pieces by Gillock. All right, that was that recital. Let's go on to the next one. Here was my idea. At that time, I had 4 sets of siblings. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to have a recital where all of my siblings play duets together and we celebrate sibling collaboration in music making? And the composers that just seemed the most obvious to me were George and Ira Gershwin. So this was 2 years ago in the spring that I did this recital. Now, finding music for my students, right? You might think that's a hard thing because, of course, George wrote Rhapsody in Blue and his preludes and some other piano music, but most of it's, you know, late intermediate, early advanced stuff. And of course, Ira was a lyricist, so they had a lot of songs, a lot of vocal songs, but when it comes to piano music, a little bit of dearth of that, right? So here are some of the resources I used. I love this book. Alfred publishes a 5-finger Gershwin classics, and they have duet accompaniments. So for a couple of my sibling pairs, they played from this, and then my beginners, of course, could play things from the 5-finger Gershwin book. And then Carol Matz, Alfred also publishes 3 volumes Gershwin for students. Book 1 is, I think, late beginner, early intermediate. This is book 2, early intermediate, book 3, intermediate. Great resource for students playing Gershwin. I had a lot of different resources I used. These are just some. I used this Gershwin piano duets. I remember this is produced by Chapel Music. I think that's distributed by Hal Leonard. I do remember simplifying one part of one of the duets for one of my sibling teams. I probably don't need to tell you, musical choice takes a lot of time. You know, this is a big investment to carefully choose music for all your students at their various different levels around one theme and one composer. But it's possible, and I think totally worth it. All right, we just had one music history party on the lives of George and Ira Gershwin, and their story is just so compelling. I just love it. It was very fun to teach my students that. I told them the story of their life and had a PowerPoint presentation, but also some wonderful videos. So there's a great video about the American in Paris taxi horns that I showed my students. And I did show them a couple of excerpts from films with some of the Gershwin songs. This is They Can't Take That Away From Me, that I showed that to my students. But in researching, you know, I just love the internet, I found some super fun Gershwin videos. I'll mention 2 of them. There is a Muppets video from a lot of years ago, the Muppets singing Swanee. And you can see, among other things, there are many penguins who join in that. It is a trip. I showed that to my students. And then I had 2 brothers play Swanee. I think that was one of the duets from the Red George Gershwin duet book I just showed you that I simplified. And they just loved playing that. And then maybe you're familiar with Darcy Lynn. She was a winner on American Idol a few years ago. She is a ventriloquist who sings, and she sang Summertime in one of her American Idol performances. And I showed that to my students, and that was just super fun. I did also show them a serious Summertime performance from a, I want to say, filmed stage production of Summertime, or of Porgy and Bess. So that was our music history party, the life of George and Ira Gershwin. And all my students then, of course, were working on Gershwin music and loving it, because what's not to love about Gershwin? So then for the recital, here's another example of one of my invitations. I called the recital Made in America, a celebration of collaborative music making and the lives of George and Ira Gershwin. So below that on the recital, you see we had lunch after the recital. And I hired two colleagues of mine with the Northern Nevada Music Teachers Association. They are a jazz duo, and during lunch, they played and sang an all Gershwin program of jazz music. So we just got to continue the fun into lunch. But then also at the very bottom, it says the lunch and recital are free, but donations will be gratefully accepted for the Northern Nevada Music Teachers Association. So one of the things that I am passionate about is supporting my local MTA. And I am also treasurer, so I am well aware of the financial situation of our Music Teachers Association and always working toward being really financially robust. But I take advantage of the large audiences that come to my recitals. There were about 170 people at this recital. And I think they donated something like $700 at this particular recital. Now, there are a lot of people on that stage you see in that photograph, and a number of my students are dressed in red, white, and blue for the Made in America theme. But there are other people on the stage who are not my students. So there are a couple of moms up there, and they're on stage because they sang Gershwin songs accompanied by their daughters. Now, I'm not a voice teacher, so this is not a voice recital. But I just took advantage of the opportunity to try to make this recital include some vocal music. And so one of my students was newly married, and she and her husband sang, accompanied by another student. And also in the picture, there are just a couple of, friends of mine who I coerced into singing, accompanied by one of my students too. So this was just a super fun recital. Up to this point, I kept trying to outdo myself. I wanted each recital to be more interesting and more engaging and more entertaining than the one that came before. But once the Gershwin recital happened, I just knew the competition's over. And it was actually wonderful to just relax and say, yes, I still want every recital to engage my audience, but I don't have to always be bigger and better. Let's just go for a really good, solid audience engaging recital. So I think I mostly accomplished that. All right, next, 1 year ago, we had a Disney recital. Now, I know there are, I'm sure, dozens of Disney recitals across the United States every year, I'm guessing. This is not unusual, but remember, I am about teaching music history. So when it came to planning the music history parties for this, I focused those parties on the Sherman brothers, Robert and Richard Sherman, who wrote the music for Mary Poppins and Winnie the Pooh and many, many other things. And again, it was collaborative brothers, right? A pianist and a lyricist. So that was fun to do that after they'd already learned about George and Ira Gershwin. But then also Alan Menken. And I found just a fabulous interview with Alan Menken that I showed my students. So I taught them about the lives and the training of those men and how they ended up composing as they do. So then at the recital, I traced the history of Disney and Disney music, and then the role of the Sherman brothers and Alan Menken. One thing I want to say about this recital, it wins the record for the greatest enthusiasm among my students in inviting their friends. There just seemed to be an extraordinary number of just friends of my students, school friends, school-age friends who came. And you see that big Mickey and Minnie there. During the reception, we had a drawing, and I gave those away to 2 audience members. The Mickey went to a high school age friend of a high school age student of mine. And the Minnie actually went to just one of my friends, who this was her first recital she had come to, and just a personal friend of mine. So that was kind of fun. All right, we're running out of time, but I did want to just mention some other recitals that I've had and the themes I use. So last fall, I had a recital focusing on what I called the Bach dynasty. It was a piano and harpsichord recital. I taught my students about the 4 famous sons of Bach, not Johann Sebastian, but his 4 sons. And of course, then that was what the recital focused on also. Seems like a long time ago, I had a celebrating childhood recital, kind of an odd pairing of composers, but the child prodigy of Mozart. And then Dmitry Kabalevsky, who was a music educator, wrote so much wonderful music for students. Oh, Fall Before Last. Oh, I loved this recital, When Women Compose, Amy Beach, Cecile Chaminade, and Melanie Bonny. Wish I could tell you about that. Maybe a conversation for a different webinar. Moonlight on the Water. This is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but Handel and Beethoven. The water is reference to Handel's water music. And of course, Moonlight reference to Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. And then there was a recital called Celebrating Bridges. These two bridge composers, C.P. Bach, bridging Baroque and classical, Scott Joplin, bridging classical and jazz. All right, so to wrap up, before I go to see if you had any questions I could answer, just some final thoughts about what I've been talking about. Students benefit from playing music in the context of the composer and time period in which the music was written, and they benefit from being part of exciting recitals that are well attended by an enthusiastic and engaged audience. I believe it with all my heart. It's why I'm willing to invest so much time into teaching music history and having my recitals go along with that. Parents benefit from their children being involved in exciting events. You know, parents love to show their kids off, and even better when it's something that's really exciting and fun and engaging. Everyone benefits. My students, their families, all of the recital attendees benefit from knowing more about music history and associating classical music with fascinating stories and piano recitals with a rip-roaring good time. So I'm just trying to change public perception to the tiny little degree that I am able. And then let's just admit, teachers benefit from having events that attract large audiences. It is good marketing. And if it sets you apart from other teachers, that's also a good thing. You know, we're all different. We have the things we're good and best and most passionate about. And I do think it's just great to celebrate that and to be different from other teachers around you. All right, that's what I had to say. If you have any questions, there's my email address, cindy@encorereno.com. And I mentioned I do have a handout of the resources I mentioned. The handout also just has listed all of the recitals that I've talked about, the title of the recital, and then the composers that I used. All right, I'm going to close my presentation now. I'm going to open the chat screen and see if you have any questions I can answer. All right, so this is the moment of awkwardness in every webinar, so just bear with me here. All right. Okay, so here is a question from Nancy. What day of the week and, sorry, my screen jumped. I love technology. All right. Do you charge extra for your parties or do you wrap it into yearly tuition? Sarah's question. I wrap it into yearly tuition. I do charge tuition for the whole year, and that's just part of that. It's just part of my budgeting for that. Have you tried situations where students get to pick their pieces? Would the outcome of the recital be different? I have had student choice recitals, so I have done that in the past. And like I said, I do often have for one student 2 or 3 possibilities, and then they do get to have a hand in choosing. But I also do, as I said, a good bit of just handing them music. And now this is just their recital pieces. They play a lot of music. Please share your experience and audience response for teachers' performance in a recital. Oh, I do sometimes perform in my recitals. I'm getting ready for an all ragtime recital, and I'm planning to perform the Crush Collision piece, which was one of the very first pieces Scott Joplin ever wrote. So I do sometimes do that. They are long. My recitals are long, and so a lot of times I don't perform just because of that. Sarah asked, how long are your music history parties? They're 2.5 hours, 5 o'clock to 7:30. I have one tonight teaching my students about ragtime and Scott Joplin. Who created the artwork for the recital invitation? My very first recital invitation I showed you was my graphic designer son. But I just Google image pianos, piano art or something. I think that painting pictures with music is maybe the recital cover she's talking about. So Google images, I love the internet. There was another question about my recital covers. I do make those myself. I do use Google image. All right, how do you know how many programs to print? Karen asked this question. I guess it's the best I can do. Sometimes I run out, sometimes I have too many. Do your adult students attend the parties as well? The answer is no. They could, I just haven't had any choose to do that. How elaborate are the meals I serve? Super easy. I have like some specific menus that I use. We do what I call tacos in a bowl. You know, chips and meat and cheese and toppings and stuff like that. We do, tonight is pizza, and I always get gluten-free because I have some of those kids. Anyway, they're super easy. A lot of times I ask parents to help serve food, but as a rule, parents aren't allowed at the parties. It's a teacher and kids thing. Someone asked if I could supply the PowerPoint. No, you can always rewatch the webinar, but because I have a lot of student images and the names of my students on recital programs and stuff, I'm just not comfortable with that. Okay, sorry, but just rewatch if you need to, or email me if you have specific questions. There's another question about, do I charge separately for parties and recitals? My tuition just covers that. It is a lot of extra work, and I do charge appropriately for that. Karen asked this question, do you ever, or have you ever had students talk to the audience, helping you with the narrative of the theme? So the short answer is yes, a little, with one big exception, and that was when Women Compose recital, my students performed a play on the life of Cecile Chaminade, Melanie Bonny, and then another one on the life of Amy Beach. That's what I had done for my music history party. I actually wrote a play for that, and the students loved it, and they wanted to do it for the recital. So it was actually just readers' theater. There were a few props, but the students were just reading from a script. It's not something we really practiced. But yes, I do sometimes involve students. Not a lot, because truthfully, they're nervous, and they're mostly just there to play, and I want to respect that. But absolutely, you could involve students in a variety of ways. What day of the week and what time of day is most successful? I'm guessing, Nancy, you're asking about the music history parties. I always do them on Friday evening, 5 to 7:30 p.m. If you're providing lunch, do you require RSVPs to the recitals? So that lunch thing was kind of a one-time event, and I did not require RSVPs. I just made a guess, and we did have enough food, and it was a ton of people. But you could absolutely do that. You could RSVP. How do you leverage parent volunteers to help you with recitals, reception, food, etc.? I just ask nice, and they say yes. I have super supportive parents, so that is not a problem for me. Cami asked the question about that Gershwin lunch. How did I fund that lunch? So that is a special situation. I have parents who catered it, and it's a special situation. All right, so I'm sorry, I can't really answer that in detail. Okay, let's see. I see a lot of comments, and thank you. I will take the time to go read those. Okay, Suzanne asked, if you charge yearly, do you require they pay for the full year at once? No, I divide it into 12 monthly payments, but I make it very clear they are not paying for that particular month. It is set tuition for the whole year, and I'm just giving them doing them the courtesy of letting them pay in monthly installments. Julie asked, how many recitals do I have a year? I have 2. I have one in the fall and one in the spring. Cami mentioned she makes posters to advertise. That is a great idea. Since you mentioned jazz, is improvisation ever part of your recitals? So only one, because I'm not a super good improvisation teacher, but I do use Forrest Kinney's pattern playbooks. So I did have a recital quite a long time ago where I had taken several of Forrest Kinney's improv ideas and I had printed them on cardstock. And during the recital, I had some students who would come up, they would literally just pick one in the recital, and then we would play that together. And that was super, super fun. As to the best time of day for my recitals, they're almost always on a Saturday afternoon. Cami said, I'd love to purchase your Reader's Theater play on women composers. So Cami, just email me, all right? We could talk about that. Okay, I think that is all the questions. Thank you for asking them. Thank you for your engagement during this webinar. If any of you are going to be in Chicago at the National Convention, I will be there. I would love to talk to you about that. Oh, I do see one question that just came in, Rebecca. How do you handle recitals and festivals or competition? This is a great question. My students participate in a number of different performance events. We do Guild. My local music teachers association has a youth piano festival. That's an adjudicated festival where there's a syllabus and students play 2 pieces from the syllabus. So when it comes to choosing recital music, I am always looking at, let's just say I'm going to do a Grieg, teach my students about Grieg. So for some of my more advanced students, I'm looking in that festival syllabus for the level they're in. Are there any Grieg pieces in this festival syllabus so that we could overlap? And of course, their recital music gets used in Guild. So I feel like I'm always balancing that, all the other events in their life. The recital is just a little part of it. I do think I'm different. A lot of recitals are practices for events, and mine are not generally like that. Okay, we are out of time, and I am sorry for that, but this has been a delight to share my life with you, my teaching life, and some about my recitals. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for being here. Cindy@encorereno.com. If you want to email me, catch me at the Chicago conference. If you see me in the hall, I would love to talk with you. So thank you so much. Have a beautiful day. Go and make your recitals better. All right, bye-bye.